Hi, MCC 1789. Continuing our discussion. Regarding the goal of capitalism, you said,
You say your goal is not the greatest accumulation possible for a few. That's admirable, but I don't think that's the same for capitalism overall.
well, I just don't believe that. Do you honestly think that most people who are in favor of capitalism really have the goal of the greatest accumulation possible for a few? Okay, well, will you at least agree with me that anarcho capitalists, even if we're wrong, don't generally have that goal? Okay, you say that,
The problem is that statism to you means public, which to us this can only be a facade. Statism is by definition private interest.
well, that's a very interesting point because, on the one hand, I think it's a ridiculous statement. But on the other hand, in a certain sense, I sort of agree with it. On the ridiculous side, well, just look around the world. It's just obvious that states are these gigantic institutions that control the lives of millions of people. They claim to represent all those people. They let people vote on things. They have public debates about the benefits and drawbacks for society as a whole of various rules they're considering imposing on people. They're public entities. On the other hand, the problem with having such a powerful institution is that people who want to control others will naturally be drawn to it. Hence, we end up with an institution that has a public face, but really is acting in the interests of a powerful elite. The private interests that you are talking about. I'm against that powerful elite. But that does not mean that I'm against all private property. It means I'm against, for example, property by decree. When some king decrees that some guy on a horse is the duke of whatever and owns some specified area of land and all that is produced on it, well, I'm against that. But that's not how all private property arises. Some private property is perfectly legitimate, as you and I have been discussing. The question is where we draw the line of what's legitimate and what isn't. Now, I don't quite agree because the definition of statism is not private interests. It's just that any time something as powerful as a state gets created, it inevitably will be grabbed by power-hungry people. It thus becomes the facade you speak of. Okay, based on your last video, my new understanding of your position on hierarchies is that you prefer to avoid all hierarchies, by which I assume you mean any organization of people that can be drawn as a tree structure. I mean, I don't think you're against hierarchical organizations of knowledge, because that sounds pretty silly, and I don't think you're a silly person. But sometimes you might have to accept some kinds of hierarchical organization of people if there is no alternative. Okay, now on the milling machine example, I'm glad you agree that mutual consent is the best way to determine how to split the profits. Suppose my neighbor and I are sharing the profits for a few months, and he comes to me and says that he'd rather have a more consistent income and that he'd be happy if I paid him an hourly wage equivalent to what he's made so far in this enterprise, divided by the number of hours he's put in. And in order to get that consistency of income, he's willing to forego the possibility of making more income, and he doesn't want the possibility of making less income either. In other words, by mutual agreement, he will be paid an agreed amount per hour, and he will voluntarily eliminate the possibility of greater income or lesser income. I, on the other hand, get to keep the income above what he gets, regardless of whether I end up with more or less than I made before. Now, if he and I negotiate and agree on an hourly wage for him, do you see anything wrong with that scenario? Okay, next.
Getting back to police, courts, and military, the restrictions I see on these as being capitalist enterprises would occur by people refusing them. Of course, some would still not do this, but the idea being elimination of the state, it seems that if they had that consciousness, they would reject these arrangements.
But you still say that some people would not refuse a capitalist organization of these functions. Some people would be in favor of a capitalist, meaning profit-based organization. So, how would you prevent such profit-based organizations?
Do you advocate that institutions with the power of force be mercenary?
That's obviously a loaded question. The word mercenary brings to mind someone who doesn't care about ethics, but only sells their services to the highest bidder. Well, I can definitely understand your concern. Since an institution with the power of force could be turned to offensive use instead of just defensive use, then wouldn't it be better to prohibit such an institution from being profit motivated? Well, my solution to that problem is different. Rather than saying an institution with the power of force cannot be profit motivated, my solution is to say that such an institution cannot be turned to offensive use. Now, how do you prevent such an institution from being organized around a profit motive without some other organization that imposes that restriction? Anybody that prohibits that would be a state. On the other hand, how would I propose preventing a defensive organization from being turned into an offensive one? Simple. Fight back. When someone attacks you, you're allowed to defend yourself. I don't have to add any additional rules. It's already built into the scenario that allows institutions of force the right to exist in the first place. Self-defense is allowed, and people have the right to free association. Regarding the milling machine being stolen out of my house, you say,
obviously theft is not acceptable.
Okay, now, a question on that. Apparently you see that even though the thief is in possession of the milling machine that he took out of my house without my consent, that doesn't make it okay for him to have it. Something should be done about it. Presumably, he shouldn't be allowed to keep it. It should be in my house for my use, since, as we said earlier, I obtained it by means that you and I both consider legitimate. Do you agree with this? Do you agree that even though the thief is in possession of the milling machine, well, that doesn't make it right for him to have it?
Let me ask you my own question. Would your community have the right to democratically organize a police force, militia, set up a court of courts, etc.? I think it would.
Absolutely. Any kind of voluntary arrangement would be allowed. But if anybody tried to impose this democratic organization on the whole community without the consent of everybody in the community, then they would be guilty of coercion against those who didn't agree, and they would likely encounter resistance. Now, if they succeed in imposing it despite the resistance, then they would be guilty of setting up a state.
And as always, I'm not claiming that anarchist society would be perfect, merely better.
Oh, yes, of course. There are so many people who look at my philosophy and say, look there, see, it isn't perfect, so therefore it obviously wouldn't work, and we should keep what we have. They just they just don't get it. That we are arguing that anarchism would be better than what humanity is burdened with now.